who is seen as a bad guy in history but was actually okay. More so sports history, but the film Cinderella Man portrayed boxer Max Baer as a murderous psychopath who gladly killed 2 fighters in the ring. In reality, he was personally devastated by these deaths. In the one he was most directly responsible for, he ended up giving his winnings from his next few fights to the fighter's family. This unfortunately happens all the time in films. When they need a villain, they'll simply create one. Imhotep. Yes, the titular villain from The Mummy was a real guy, but he wasn't a soul-sucking killer who made off with the pharaoh's wife. In reality, he was a skilled architect and physician who designed the famous Saqqara step pyramid, which still stands today. Imhotep is even considered the father of Egyptian medicine, as he oversaw the healthcare of thousands of pyramid builders and wrote a detailed papyrus manuscript that described different illnesses and their treatments. Even though he wasn't a pharaoh, he was given divining status after death due to his contributions. He was only one of 2 non-pharaohs to receive this title. Richard III of England is getting a better look. They say he was actually a good king and that after he was deposed it was propaganda that ruined his name. Came here for this. Richard was done dirty by those slanderous tutors. In all seriousness, there was a lot to admire about Richard. At worst he was a man of his time. Captain William Bligh of the HMS Bounty, portrayed as a monster in novels and films. He was actually a well thought of naval officer who when forced off his ship sailed a small craft 4,000 miles with minimal provisions. When there was no suitable craft available, he and his crew then built their own and sailed from East Timor back to England. He was exonerated by the courts and had a successful career as Governor of New South Wales. The Rum Rebellion was during his time and has, though perhaps unfairly, been seen since as least partly incited by him. Lucrezia Borgia wasn't actually as much of a villainous femme fatale as she was made out to be. I enjoy the character archetype, but she wasn't an example of one. A dingo actually did come and eat Lindy Chamberlain's infant child. Unfortunately, that sort of thing is extremely hard to prove one way or another and was only resolved fairly recently, 2012. For the last 41 years people made fun of a lady whose child was eaten by a wild animal, akin to a coyote for the non-Aussies. That crap is fricked up. Seinfeld, Simpsons, Rugrats, Modern Family, just to name a couple of mass media productions that have made fun of her in their worldwide reach. Meryl Streep played her in a reenactment of the fricking ordeal. I feel so bad for that poor woman. Her kid's death became a meme for 41 fricking years. Yes, not 32 years. I'm saying 41 years because it still is. Most of all, I blame the Australian police and government for fricking this up and releasing the details. That crap is not right. Not really seen as much, but Claudius was a decent emperor. He wasn't quite Augustus, but if you compare him to the men who preceded and succeeded him, Gaius and Nero, he was a son. Not quite history, but the Grim Reaper. Grim isn't killing you, he's just keeping you company. He's the buddy system. Also, people outside of Romania hate Vlad the Impaler, but in Romania, he's seen as a hero. William Bligh, of Mutiny on the Bounty fame. In pretty much every movie adaptation of the story, Bligh is depicted as a cruel slave driver who has men mercilessly whipped for the slightest infraction, and the crew finally had enough of his tyranny and mutinied. Utter and complete bulls. In reality, Bligh was notably easy on his men for the day, and there is no record he ever ordered a flogging. He was known to allow men on watch in bad weather to come and warm up inside his own cabin. He and Fletcher Christian had been longtime BFFs before the Bounty. The mutiny happened because after long, hard months at sea, the Bounty had a 5-month layover in the tropical paradise of Tahiti, where many men and the crew began to live ashore with native women, and military discipline started to come unglued. Bligh had to enforce increasingly harsh restrictions, because the natives were eager for any sort of trade, and to get a little native tail, sailors were actually pulling nails out of the ship for trade. He came down hard on Christian because it was his duty to keep the crew in line and he was failing at it. So Christian and about half the crew mutinied, and set Bligh and 18 followers adrift in a small, dangerously overloaded boat. In one of the most mind-boggling feats of survival seamanship in history, Bligh managed to navigate the boat some 3,500 miles to safety. Paul Rubens. For decades of my life I was under the impression that Pee Wee Herman was guilty of some child predator crap. But no, dude was just spotted in a pee theater. I don't think the masturbation claims were ever even substantiated, meaning he lost his career because he illegally watched pee in his personal free time. 1000% agreed. His show is a treasure. Alfred Nobel. This is kind of a stretch but funny story. Before his death, a news publication accidentally printed his obituary and they basically blamed him for so much death and destruction, being the inventor of dynamite. So knowing what the world really thought about him and his legacy, he decided to have a new will written up describing the Nobel Prize, and he would give most of his fortune to that foundation to acknowledge and celebrate those who, during the preceding year, have conferred the greatest benefits to humankind. His surviving family only got to share 0.5% of his fortune. At the time of his death he owned 93 factories and about 30% of all patents in Sweden, so he would have been remembered as a bad guy, but that wake-up call changed him, his legacy, and the world. And, crazily enough, dynamite was invented and used because it was safer than the alternatives. Not a real person, but Western media has sort of equated Hades with the Christian devil, which is very much not who he was in actual Greek mythology. In fact, he's actually one of the most sober and well-behaved of the Greek gods. The only mischief he ever really gets up to is tricking Persephone into living with him. Otherwise he mostly kept to himself and did his job. It's funny because Zeus was basically an insane rapist and Hera was a jealous monster who loved to torment her stepchildren in a multitude of horrific ways. Thomas Sankara. When he led Burkina Faso, it was probably the most progressive African nation at the time, and even by today's standards it would be up there when compared to them. He was also responsible for not only making it less reliant on France, but also its name, which used to be Upper Volta, and interestingly, since he was a guitarist, he also wrote the new national anthem. He was assassinated in 1987 after a coup. The play Mozart and Salieri, and later the film Amadeus, popularized the idea that Mozart's rival, Antonio Salieri, was a huge jerk who ultimately killed Mozart, but in reality there's no indication that Mozart was poisoned, or that Salieri had anything to do with his death. Also, Salieri was a philanthropist and probably a lot more decent than theater film made him out to be when they needed an antagonist for Mozart. Salieri was the crap we can thank him for Beethoven, and he also taught Mozart's son Franz, which I think is really lovely. My bro Hades is the nicest man in all of Greek mythology. He's kind to his wife, doesn't cheat on her, and sure, he kidnapped her, but it was ordered he did, and Persephone really likes him and they love each other. He's always held truth to people, never cheated someone on deals, and when some dude tried to bang his wife he tortured him for all of eternity. The man is a Chad. Anne Boleyn. When the king sets his eyes on you, you don't really get to say no. He'd already had his way with her sister and discarded her and their bastard son. So instead of being another ruined cast-off, she played her bad hand to the best of her ability and made herself a queen. Eventually Henry got tired of her, which was his MO, after she failed to produce any living sons and he'd already set his sights on Jane. He needed a viable reason to get rid of her, and what better way to do it than rumors of infidelity, incest and witchcraft? He probably would have done something similar to Catherine of Aragon if she wasn't from a royal house you did not want to frick with. Helen of Troy is also similarly maligned. All she did was leave her, probably British, husband for another man. Agamemnon didn't give a single frick about his brother's wife, property, but her abduction did give him a perfect reason to go to war. Even if she'd tried to hand herself over, to almost certainly be killed by her enraged husband, it wouldn't have ended anything because she was just an excuse. Anne Boleyn is thought to have had Rh blood, which would make her body kill all but the first baby if there were Rh+. I hear that the guard from Titanic who shot a civilian and then himself in the movie actually helped board passengers into lifeboats until the ship took him down with it. There's a monument to him for his heroic actions in his hometown in I think Scotland or Ireland. That was BS. From the movie. Cleopatra. A lot of historians for the longest time saw her as Augustus portrayed her, as an evil seductress and ruined perfectly good Romans. It was a lot more complicated and she was a very smart, effective ruler. Was she perfect? No, no one is, but she isn't this monster people like to portray her as. Thankfully, this one is changing, which is good to hear. The Persian Empire gets a bad rap these days. Now make no mistake, the Persians were brutal imperialists and slave traders, but then so was every other empire at the time. The Persian Empire was actually one of the most diverse and culturally accepting empires in human history. Their standard policy of leadership was to allow cultures they took over to retain their own customs, their own laws, and even their own leaders. Provided they didn't rebel and paid their taxes on time, they more or less left you alone. Plus all subjects got to benefit from the rich trade routes and the security of their armies. On average, Persian citizens, in particular women, enjoyed more rights than nearly any other empire of the time. So whilst I can understand not wanting to be conquered by them, compared to the alternatives, you could have done a lot worse. Marie Antoinette. She was far from perfect, yes, but she was shipped away from home at 14 years old to a country that hated pretty much everything about her homeland, with an economy that was already starting to fray at the seams. Yes, she lived extravagantly, being literally the queen and having to keep up appearances, but she was often falsely accused of major frick-ups that she had nothing to do with. She never said let them eat cake. She was impersonated and held responsible for one of the most expensive jewelry pieces in France's history. The people of France were never going to like her, and took every opportunity to hate her more. Her hair was a boat at least once though. That's historically accurate. Khrushchev was actually the bigger man during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He initiated the negotiations and even let Kennedy look like the hero by keeping America's side of the bargain secret, not to mention all the measures he took afterwards to prevent something like it from happening again. I always learned that Hannibal, the great general, was a terrifying invading force for the Romans in my history class. The Romans were a terrifying invading force to literally everyone else, and kept slaves. Hannibal is only the bad guy if the Romans are good guys. Brutus. He's gone down as committing one of history's greatest betrayals, but what he actually did was choose his republican ideals over a man he personally loved, who had sparked a civil war with an illegal invasion of Italy, and was unquestionably acting like an autocrat. I'm not saying Elizabeth Bathory was totally innocent, but I do find it highly sus that the guy who led the investigation into her crimes was the same guy that her dying husband had made her guardian, and who wound up owning every bit of property she lost after the trial. Medusa swore her life and allegiance to a goddess as a temple maiden, told a god no when he wanted her because 1. She had to remain chaste, and 2. Maybe she just doesn't want you, babe. Dude. Said douche god responds by sexually assaulting her. To punish Medusa for her crimes, her own goddess turned her into a gorgon. Cue my eternal rage fit. Homegirl is on an island alone and all these heroes go on quests to slay the monster for glory. She defended herself and is portrayed as a grotesque evil creature. Cool runnings. The Swiss were kind and welcoming to the Jamaicans in bobsled. When the film came out, the Jamaicans felt bad for how distorted it made the Swiss to be sneering villains. Some view Eisenhower as a bad guy because he was a military leader and war equals bad, then president who was viewed as a do-nothing president. But I think that's really misleading. 1. There's really no evidence he was a bad leader. In fact, most historians reflect on him positively as a general. He was a key part of the victory. His leadership was critical to the US and Allied actions and ultimate victory. 2. He wasn't a do-nothing president. His efforts behind the interstate highway system made much of our modern life happen. All because he thought the road system in Europe during the war was really good and wanted the same in the US. Our economy is based on the results of that progress he made. Our ability to get cheap food from the Midwest to the coasts is based on this. E-commerce is based on this. He was a freaking visionary. Our lives would be drastically different without that highway system. The internet wouldn't be used for commerce without that system. 3. His caution regarding the military-industrial complex was well warranted despite many of his contemporaries acting like they felt he was insane. Scrooge McDuck. He was actually very philanthropic and donated millions to charities. He did do 6 months for tax fraud, but who hasn't? If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.